women and men in work and domestic work are clearly the things that direct flows of women and men in and out of employment. And in this last film, we see how airline stewardesses were regarded as, above all else, very feminine. You note that all of the women, all of the employees are women, for one thing. In fact, they're not women, sorry, they're girls, quote unquote. And they do a kind of care work in the air. Note how it's all but assumed that such young women are doing this work on the way to becoming mothers and wives. The narrator of the film tells us that within 2 years, most women have gone on to marriage, and so they don't have long careers in the airline. And also notice the emphasis on women's appearance, right? And the assumption that they are to be beautiful and smiling and pleasant and heterosexual. Finally, also recall the racial character of these women. They're nearly all white. So the point is that work can be highly gendered, racialized, and organized around heterosexuality. And those are the kinds of themes that sociologists try to pick up in their work and analyze. Okay, so moving forward, so how do sociologists understand gender inequality in the labor force? There are a few different theories that we're going to want to focus on. I've given you a slide here that outlines 4 theories of gender inequality in the labor market. Now, let me caveat this by saying that we'll treat each of these separately, but that's not to say that sociologists don't see the ways these can combine and work in concert together to produce gender inequality. And it's likely that some theories are better at explaining some kinds of gender inequality in certain aspects of the labor market than others. But in any event, with that said, so there are 4 theories of gender inequality that we'll talk about today. The first is occupational segregation. The second is human capital theory, or differences in human capital between men and women. The third refers to social capital differences. And the fourth we'll call statistical discrimination / sexism. So let's turn to that first theory, occupational segregation. Now, within occupational segregation, there are sort of 2 components. The first refers to internal labor markets. So labor markets that are internal to a given industry. And here we have this concept of short promotion ladders, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Then a second aspect of this theory of occupational segregation looks at horizontal occupational segregation and the concept of incomparable work between men and women. Okay, so I'm going to take number 1 first. This is a bit hard to see. Well, you can probably make out some of it, not help along the way. So here's a really nice demonstration of an internal labor market within a supermarket. So here you have a supermarket, you have the sort of command chain, okay? Now, at the bottom, you have entry-level positions. So these 4 boxes represent entry-level positions into the supermarket. You have the produce department, the grocery department, bakery and deli, and general merchandise. Now, one thing to note right away is that there are only 2 entry-level positions that allow for upward mobility, right? So you're either in the grocery department or you're in the produce department. If you're not in those 2, there are no pathways to mobility, i.e. you have a dead-end job. Now, within the entry-level positions, the question becomes, what is the ratio of men to women? And what we find here in this typical grocery store is that in the produce department, over 80% of workers are male. Over 80%, or put differently, about 20% are women. And in the grocery department, it's about half and half. Now, in the 2 dead-end entry-level positions, 93.7% are female for the bakery and deli, and 91 or 92% make up the general merchandise department. So this gives you a very clear sense of horizontal occupational segregation. So you have 4 different kinds of jobs that it might be, in terms of prestige and pay, they're about equal. So we're not really putting them in a hierarchical relationship to one another. We're locating them spatially horizontally, because one is not necessarily more prestigious or paying better than any other. And yet, that can be very deceptive, because even though one may get equal pay and prestige across these entry-level positions, in fact, only 2 lead to promotion. The one that leads to the fastest track to promotion is the produce department, where you shoot right up the next ladder up. The next post up is produce department manager, and then from there, it's a quick hop and jump to store manager. Grocery department, there's an intermediate stage there, assistant grocery department manager, and then you move up to grocery department manager, and then store manager. So here's a really great example of a gendered internal labor market, wherein women are vastly overrepresented in dead-end entry-level positions. And in those positions where there's room for mobility, the fastest mobility track has the smallest amount of women, and still it's only 20% women. And the grocery department has about half and half. Now, as you move up the chain of command, you find that the percentage of women is fewer and fewer and fewer, right? So that by the time you get to these higher level positions, produce department manager, only about 5% women. Grocery department manager, only about 8% women. Store manager, 3%. So I present this to you because it's a real simple and straightforward way of thinking about internal labor markets and what we can call short promotion ladders. So women have no promotion ladders in the first 2 to the right of those entry-level positions. And there is a promotion ladder, but a longer one for grocery department where women are more represented than in the produce department. It's also an example of something called the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling is a metaphor that's used in sociology to talk about the limits upon which women can get promoted. So the glass ceiling is a metaphor, and it relies on this idea that the ceiling itself blocks women from moving past it, from moving into the most upper level positions. And it's glass because the idea is that it's not part of the formal code of a given corporation or a given industry. You're not going to find in writing anywhere where it will say women shall not proceed beyond, store level management. It's glass because the idea is that it's more or less invisible. But nevertheless, it works like a ceiling to block women from breaking through it into the most upper level positions of a given industry. And in here, roughly, you can see evidence of a glass ceiling in the sense that only 3.1% of store managers, the top position, are represented by women. Okay, now a second dimension of occupational sex segregation has to do with the clustering of men and women in certain kinds of jobs with systematic different levels of prestige and pay. So female-dominated occupations, again like primary school teaching and nursing, compared to male-dominated occupations, tend to pay less and they tend to have less prestige. So the sociological question emerges, why? Why is it that the women that work do, the kinds of work that women do, are rewarded less than the kinds of work that men do? Medicine is a fantastic example. So as you know, there are a multitude of specialties within medicine. You go to medical school, you get your medical degree, and then you have years and years to train and specialize in a given field within medicine. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of pediatricians, so doctors who work with children, the vast majority of pediatricians are women. pediatricians undergo some of the most rigorous training relative to other medical specialties, because they have to learn not only medicine as it relates to adults, but also medicine as it relates to childhood, disease manifestation as it relates to children. They also have to learn how to deal with children and deal with worried parents. So again, pediatricians undergo some of the most rigorous training relative to other medical specializations. Yet by and large, pediatricians make much less than general practitioners. And they also make considerably less than many other medical specializations that require considerably less training. So why is that? Another example, a telephone repairman in Canada. Compare a telephone repairman with a nursery school teacher. Telephone repairmen are vastly, by and large, men, and nursery school teachers are, by and large, women. Now, the repairman earns a pretty decent income, while the nursery school teacher is among the poorest paid workers in Canada. In fact, on average, people that shampoo and manicure dogs earn more than preschool teachers. It's questionable whether it takes less training and skill to teach a young child skills than it takes to wash a dog. So this brings us to the question of what we call incomparable work, whereby the skills involved in women's work, and I'm putting that in quotes because I'm not meaning to essentialize the kind of work that women are often clustered within, but rather to say just that in terms of their rates of participation, they're typically involved in these kinds of occupations. So, in general, what we find is that the occupations that are either female-dominated or are associated with women's work, that is, care work, like nursing, primary school teaching, pediatricians, maybe even flight attendants. These kinds of professions are afforded less status and less pay than other kinds of work. That is, the kinds of work that women do, if you extrapolate from the concept of motherhood and care work, and then you move that to the workforce, those jobs that have that connotation of mothering, of care work, tend to be far less well regarded in society, and they're paid less. Thence, the preschool teacher makes far less than a telephone repairman. It's also interesting to note that when men enter female-dominated occupations, they're often stigmatized for working in those occupations. Like, note we have this idea of the male nurse. Right? Why don't we just say nurse? Why do we have to say the male nurse? Well, one of the reasons why we say the male nurse is because 95% of nurses are women. So we have this automatic assumption that a nurse is a woman. So we modify nurse with male in order to define precisely what we're talking about. But male nurses are typically, they report feeling quite stigmatized. Their parents, their friends giggle, maybe they're on a date, seems a little suspicious, who knows, right? But the point is that when men enter female-dominated occupations, there is this stigma that they have to deal with. As if there's something, what, unmasculine or emasculating about being a male nurse. There's something about doing care work, because we regard that as women's work, because we regard that in the society in general as inferior work, that somehow there's this negative connotation attached to it. Now, this makes a very vital point. Earnings and prestige in the labor market are not simply a function of market mechanisms like supply and demand, but rather, earnings and prestige in the labor market are strongly influenced by the values that we hold as a society regarding the importance of work and the value of work. We don't value care work. Now, in our society, these standards systematically undervalue the kinds of skills within jobs that women are most concentrated in. Okay, so this is why truck drivers and dog groomers make more than teachers. Okay, returning to the 4 theories of gender inequality in the workforce, let's move on to the second theory, which is the theory of human capital. What is human capital? Human capital is a concept that captures at least 3 aspects of what a worker brings to the table in a job. A, commitment to the job. B, educational attainment. And C, job experience. So those that focus on human capital say this: look, if women are earning less than men, on average, the reason is that women on average have less human capital than men. That is, on average, women have less commitment to the job than men. They have less educational attainment than their male competitors, and they have less job experience when they come to the job. So therefore, they have less human capital, and this is why women are unequal in the labor force. Now, of course, many sociologists think this is a highly problematic formulation for a number of reasons. So I'm going to give you some of the criticisms of human capital. First, sociologists point out that employment settings can give unequal amounts of training and work experience to men as opposed to women. So in other words, employment settings themselves can favor men over women by giving them expanded training courses, more certificates, allowing them to take greater risks at work, in essence giving them greater opportunities to increase their human capital while on the job. So even if a man A and woman A come to the job with the same human capital in the beginning, the job itself can work to differentially value men over women, providing more training and more job opportunities to men than women, so that over time, men do have more human capital, but that's because of the preferential treatments they receive within the workplace. So in that example, differences in human capital, yes, they may exist, but sometimes when they do exist, they're more an artifact of sexist employment practices. They're not actually part of the pre-existing differences that women and men bring to the workforce. Other critics remind us that if there are human capital differences between men and women, and there may be on average, they often arise because of one major factor. And that major factor is that women do the vast majority of work in the family, caring for children, domestic labor in the home. And of course, they have to deal with those who are mothers, have to deal with pregnancy, which takes time and energy. So given the time-consuming nature of these activities, which women are disproportionately affected by, women simply have less time and less energy to spend acquiring job training and to doing paid work. So women disproportionately relative to men suffer the economic brunt of childcare and are penalized for it in the labor market. In a society where men and women did equal amounts of domestic work, where they did equal amounts of childcare, taking care of the house, caring for elderly, that kind of thing, we might see a very different story around human capital differences. Those differences might erode between the sexes. So penalties to human capital for women. First, think about career disruptions owing to pregnancy. Technology may one day plant an embryo into a male, and then they one day bear children. But until then, women are the ones who are bearing pregnancy, who are bearing the responsibility and the energy that it requires to be pregnant. Of course, that has to take a toll on human capital, right? It just makes sense. Second, as I just said, women are by and large responsible for child and elderly care, much more than men even today. Women are much more responsible for domestic labor every day compared to their male counterparts. So, career disruptions occur because of getting pregnant and having babies. Most countries, like Canada, don't provide help for women in caring for their children. There's no unpaid child care, okay, or unpaid work for the elderly. So that burden falls primarily on the shoulders of women. Also, because of heavy domestic demands, many women are not able to work full-time. They work part-time, so they get less experience. They may work seasonal jobs, or they may work on contract, or they may work multiple small jobs. This kind of work is called non-standard, and that's number 4, non-standard work. So non-standard workers earn lower wages, and they receive fewer benefits from full-time paid workers. Like as an example, they usually lack pension benefits. And non-standard work is much more common among women than men. Why? Again, the argument is because of the domestic burdens that women are forced to deal with. Even when women do work full-time in the paid labor force, we have to remember that women continue to shoulder the disproportionate amount of domestic responsibilities. And that leads to what some sociologists call the double shift. The double shift. So women work at home, doing the domestic labor, caring for children, preparing food, etc. And then they go to work full-time, the public local work, and then they return home back to the private home where, again, they're involved in domestic labor. So that's the double shift. This, of course, will affect the amount of time that they're able to devote to developing human capital, and it has negative consequences for their earnings. So here's a few slides that sort of demonstrate some of this. Percentage of men and women in the paid labor force. You can see on the left, in Canada, 1946 to 2010. In fact, there is quite a growth in women entering the labor force, but still it's less than men, considerably. Male-female differences in rich countries. In 2008, you can see that Italy has the greatest amount of male-female differences in the paid labor force. Canada falls somewhere in the middle of the richest countries, and Sweden has the lowest difference of men and women in paid labor. Paid and unpaid work, men and women, 25 to 54 years old, in Canada, 85 to 2005. Pay attention to that yellow part of each bar. You note that those numbers refer to hours of day of paid and unpaid work. So housework is the yellow. You see that men in 1985 did on average 1 hour of housework per day. Women in 1985 did more than double, almost 3 times as much at 2.8. Now move over to men in 2005. Men in 2005 did about 1.4 hours of housework. Women did almost double at 2.4 hours. So what does the government do to offset some of these domestic responsibilities? Public spending on family benefits in 2005. You see a full range of the percentage of GDP that goes to family benefits. And Canada, Canada's in red, so it actually has some of the smallest spending on family benefits relative to other countries. France having the largest. Child care in Canada by province. Even the province with the highest amount of child care, which is Quebec, has only about 36% of children between the ages of 0 and 12 for whom there is regulated child care space. Ontario falls considerably lower, about 13%. Why am I showing you this? It's boring. The point is that if the Canadian government took seriously the burden of domestic work that women are primarily responsible for, there would be much more child care implemented by the state in order to support women and help equal out this burden. Okay. Participation rate. Women with children less than 6 years old. You can see how this is played out from 1994 to 2004 between Ontario, Quebec, the prairies, and the Atlantic. Okay. As an aside, let me just say that what we've just outlined here under human capital theory, we've said that human capital may matter, but if it matters, it's not because men and women are essentially different in work commitments, or that they have to be different in terms of job skills and training, but rather that the social organization of domestic work is what causes differences in human capital. So that if the state made more provisions and created policies that evened out that domestic work, and or if men shared equally with women the burden of domestic work, we would see these human capital differences. And rather than women making 73 cents on the dollar, or rather than women being disproportionately located in non-standard work, we might see a lot of that change. So the bottom line is, it's the social organization of the society that permits this to happen, for better or worse. Now, as an aside, what I just presented for you is a Marxist feminist analysis. A Marxist feminist analysis. So it's a feminist analysis of gender inequality that draws from Marxism. And what it says is that women's inferior status in the labor market is, in fact, a product of the human capital deficit. But that deficit arises not because women are inherently less interested in work than men, but because of the social organization of domestic care and domestic labor between men and women, whereby women do, again, most of the domestic work and subsequently pay a huge penalty in their ability to compete with men in the labor market. Okay, back to the four theories. Let's turn now to the third theory, which is social capital. What is social capital? How popular you are? Well, that's not entirely wrong, with a few modifications. Social capital is a term in sociology that refers to the ties that people have to other people of influence. The ties that people have to other people of influence. So if you have a lot of close ties to the homeless outside your front door, that would not be considered a form of social capital. And I'm not trying to put down those ties, I encourage those ties. But rather, those ties don't equal social capital because typically homeless folks don't have a lot of social influence, right? Social capital refers to the connections that you have to people that have a lot of influence. So as an example, if you told me that you're buddies with your local MP, and you know the deputies of the police force, and you hang out with the president of the University of Toronto, and you know a lot of the government officials, that would be considered a measure of social capital because you have direct connections to people who have influence. If you're an aspiring actor